Happy Friday, homies, and welcome to the fortnightly tech talk that we're putting on. Myself, Peter Lewis, and my partners in crime, Dan Stinton from Guardian Australia and Lizzie from Digital Rights Watch, will be launching into our discussion in just a couple of minutes as people file into the room on what's a wet and cold day in Sydney, and don't know what it's like down in Melbourne, Lizzie, but
pretty grim.
Pretty grim in general, and Dan, of course, basking in Perth in a shared working space.
Like Hamilton free, of course.
Yeah. So, as we're all in the room, before we get cracking, just the usual start to recognise that wherever we are in Australia, we are on land of Indigenous people. I'm on the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present, emerging, and recognise the land we're on was never ceded. And at this strange and evolving time, just recognising that this is part of a sequence of history, not the end of history, I think is important. Also, for those who are regulars, you know, use the chat, turn your camera on, keep it nice, and we'll record it and share it. The purpose of the Tech Talks is really just to keep the community going and in a way indulge in my favourite political issue, which is the politics of technology, with two people that I've met along the journey who are living it every day. It's a great opportunity for us, I think, every fortnight to be building up our understanding of the complexity of the politics of technology. And because we do it every fortnight, I think some of these are evolving conversations that we can build on fortnight to fortnight, but also things are moving so fast. So as somebody in the chat asked last week to send out a list of readings for today, and so some of you might have got those, but I was just blown away by how much had actually happened over the last fortnight and how the world seems to be changing really fast in the world of tech. So, and the big event, which I thought we'd frame today's discussion around, has been the appearance in front of the US Congress of the 4 CEOs of the largest tech companies on earth. They were in a Zoom as well, from what I could see. But whereas the last time big tech had appeared before the Congress, it was kind of an embarrassing sort of exercise in teaching congressmen and women the basics of Tech 101. This time it was clear that the Congress had done its homework. The committee that was tasked to be looking at the impact of big tech on competition in the context of US antitrust laws was chaired by a Rhode Island senator called Senator Ciccolini. It looked like he had done significant research into this. Apparently it was a 12-month project where they'd been taking testimony from former staff, from people, from businesses that had been faced with anti-competitive practices. But so by the time the 4 CEOs were on the stand, there wasn't much room for spinning their way out of it. So I don't know if any of you have watched either the highlights. The whole thing is 5.5 hours, which is probably, even for us that are locked away, a little bit too long, but it is a cracking show. So before we talk about what we learned, Lizzie, as our lawyer in the room, antitrust, what is it? Where does it come from? And why do the Americans have it and we don't?
Well, I would say we do have kinds of antitrust law. It's usually called competition law in Australia, but the origins of antitrust law in the United States really comes from the 19th century when, lawmakers weren't concerned with consumer welfare necessarily, but they were concerned by the threat of robber barons, large firms, large trusts coming together and exploiting that market power to the detriment of democracy. So the Act is the Sherman Act. There's the Clayton Act as well, but the key provisions are in the Sherman Act. And Senator Sherman, in his speech, talks about the threat to democracy of large companies that can influence society beyond just in their own marketplace. And I think that's a really interesting heritage to remember, because as we came into the latter half of the 20th century, I think our idea of what is competition consumer law changed. And it really came about with kind of Reaganomics, that kind of thing, deregulation throughout the 70s and 80s. And it became much more a prioritisation of consumer welfare as the key priority in competition law, rather than, say, managing and trying to to limit the role of monopolies and the capacity of companies, single firms, to influence society. And there's a really interesting article that tracks this, actually, that's relevant to what we're talking about today. There's a woman called Lena Khan, who's a legal scholar. She's written a very long article, which is why I didn't include it in the readings, because it's, I think, almost 20,000 words. But she talks about Amazon's antitrust paradox and talks about how these companies might be able to offer you low prices, but there are other consequences that come with that from a competition law perspective. And our approach, prioritising consumer welfare, that's come about in recent decades, has really lost our capacity to understand the problems that come with monopolisation in this sector. And so what I think we're seeing is the origins of competition law in the US being about democracy and the threat of large companies, a swing towards deregulation to prioritise consumer welfare, and perhaps a swing back with people like Elizabeth Warren, obviously, but many others since then, talking about the need to break up big tech because of the threat that they pose to society generally for ideas not just beyond, or going beyond, really, consumer welfare.
So Robert Reich has written a lot about how the weakening of antitrust through the 80s and the 90s was really one of the key drivers to broader inequality in American society. So what I'm interested in is, why are these laws back being used again, and will it require, I assume, fresh judicial interpretation of the way the laws operate if, as you say, the focus goes from just being a cheaper price, and let's face it, big tech offers free, as opposed to, I guess, the government seeing the market as a construct and it needs to be operating for a broader public benefit, particularly in the context of, I think, what Franklin Furr in his Atlantic article, which is great, this week, called competitive capitalism. So you need antitrust to have competitive capitalism, which is almost, in the American sense, a precursor to a real democratic system.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting because you can be a kind of devotee of the free market and still also worry about monopolisation, obviously, because it is crushing innovation. And that's one of the key arguments that lots of people make who are trying to convince perhaps those who have traditionally thought consumer welfare is the key determinant of competition law, is to say, well, look at how these companies buy up their competitors and crush them, or pick off what they like, something like Facebook stories, making use of that functionality and putting it into Instagram and Facebook, Instagram being owned by Facebook, therefore killing Snapchat, which was the company that originated that idea, and it's what made it a very popular platform for a brief period. And so then there's an idea that the marketplace should be a place in which innovation is incentivized, and that butts up against the idea that the marketplace is also driven by profit-making firms who will seek to crush their competitors, and the misuse of that market power, which is what the terminology that's commonly used in Australian competition law, for example, is coming to the fore more. So it's about taking threads of judicial reasoning and arguing which one should be prioritised at this moment. I mean, common law, judge-made law through cases is always changing, and that's one of its strengths as a system. But here's an example, I think, where we could start to see a swing back away from more recent analysis and understandings of competition law that prioritise other market-based reasons for opposing monopolisation.
In that context, it really was quite compelling watching some of the CEOs being called upon to justify the way they went about their business. I think, in a way, Amazon's the most glaring example because they're kind of a marketplace and also a vendor. And Bezos was being called upon to defend, sort of what one particular sort of practice, which is the cloning of competitors. So he's got a platform which allows you to observe the way the vendor operates, but also the ability not just to replicate that, but then preference the replicator on the marketplace. And in a way, he was quite open, saying, yeah, that happens. So Daniel, Amazon is the marketplace, but it was interesting that those sort of practices were also being sort of admitted to by the other CEOs as well.
Yeah, I think the point that a lot of them were making is that, and the reason why Bezos was as forward, if you like, about that was they were asking that you don't look at this just as an online only comparison. You look at it in the context of they're competing against Walmart and others, and that's exactly the same practice as what Walmart do. The difference here, I think, is that the insight and the ability for them to control the market is far greater than what we've seen in the offline world. And so I think the ability to abuse the market power which they have accumulated is far more substantial. So yeah, I think I mean Amazon. I haven't watched all of the hearing, but I've watched a substantial proportion of it, and I think it's interesting. I think Amazon did not perform that well, and Bezos did not perform that well. I think there's going to be some action coming from that. I'm interested if you think that's likely in your view, Lizzie.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. You know, I mean, just in case people don't use Amazon, just so you know, when we talk about it being a marketplace, but also then using that data and analytics to crush its competitors, you know, there's what's interesting about this hearing as well is hearing from real world people who've suffered the consequences of this. So there's a textbook seller who talks about this, how they was, you know, their company was selling information, and then when Amazon picked up that was a successful business that was using the Amazon infrastructure to sell their product, it immediately started offering a competitive product and prioritizing that in searches. And you can see how powerful it is to be able to see all your competitors in your marketplace and then sell your own products using their data, and analyzing how the market works according to them, and hearing the real world consequences for everyday people who've built up a business, who kind of have devoted themselves to this, and then that disappearing almost overnight is quite confronting, I think, because it's a bit, you know, kind of this question, it's all statistics in terms of market dominance, until you realize really it does affect everyday people who are trying to and struggling to kind of build up small businesses. But I think it is a really interesting question as to whether there'll be any action taken to break it up. And obviously this was a controversial issue in the United States when action was taken by the Department of Justice to break up Microsoft in the 90s. And there were real questions around whether that stifled innovation, you know, whether the company should have been entitled to carry on because it had devoted all these energies and innovative resources into building a large company. But there's another argument which says, well, without the breakup of something like Microsoft and without them continuing to be concerned about the anti-competitive consequences of actions they might take, you might not have got other innovators, and the example that's given is often Google. I mean, I think there's probably limitations to that argument that breaking up a company like that enables greater innovation. I think that's true to some degree, not always as much as we think, but I think we should be clear that even though largely US regulators have been a bit soft touch and tend to be soft touch compared to, say, their European counterparts, they have taken action in the past to break up big companies. So I don't think we should write it off. And what this hearing shows is that lawmakers see politically that the writing's on the wall for some of these companies, that people aren't really content with how online life works and want to see a change. And so that may be a reason as much as anything else that the public sentiment has shifted.
Hey, Dan, what were your other takeouts and sort of reflections on the testimony?
I was fascinated by the difference between the Democratic questions and the Republican questions. And I found that the Republicans were almost exclusively focused on a perceived bias against conservative voices amongst these digital platforms. I saw this amazing tweet, I can't believe it, or funny tweet, I can't remember who it was that said it, but said that if the platforms are censoring conservative voices, they're doing a bloody bad job of it, which I think is a fair point. But it's interesting. I mean, rightly, I think the Republicans have received criticism for their focus on that. But I think it comes back to, if you step back though, it does come back to, I think, where Lizzie started with this conversation, and it does suggests that these platforms have not just economic power, but political power. And that really is at the heart of what the Republicans, I think, were getting at. Now, misplaced, I don't think there's any evidence at all that the platforms are censoring Republican voices at all. In fact, probably the opposite, if anything. But that said, I think it demonstrates the point, particularly with Facebook as an example. Do we really want one substantial social media platform controlling all of what most consumers see when they start their internet sessions? And I think the answer to that is definitely no. And so there does need to be a remedy from this. And I think breakup is something which does need to be seriously considered, just to enable a plurality of voices and other platforms to be able to control or have a say over what the discourse is.
Yeah, it was really interesting, the different approaches, as always, of the Democrats and Republicans. And the Democrats are seriously having a crack at setting up a condition for a Democratic administration with control of both houses after November to seriously address the power of big tech. But I also thought the Republicans' frustration at the ubiquity and their sense of the control and power of these big tech companies also fed into the broader project that things are a little bit out of control and it's time to rein them in. Lizzie also mentioned, I've just put in the chat, and I saw Amy in there mentioning the work of Lena Khan as well. What came out when I was researching this in one of the articles was she's actually been seconded to this inquiry. So to the extent that her thinking is being seen as groundbreaking, it's also actually feeding into the system, which is interesting, isn't it? We talk about the American system being broken at the moment, but it seems to be an example where the best minds and the process are coming together to at least start that process of holding the leadership of big tech to account.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. She's from the Open Markets Institute, which has done lots of work on this previously. I mean, there has been some controversy there because they did end up coming out of, I think it was the New America Foundation, where one of the scholars there was critical of Google and ended up losing their job. There was a minor flurry of controversy around that, which both parties don't claim no responsibility for. But I do think it is interesting that there's a space being carved out for this kind of scholarship, which is then driving policy and is picking up on the popular sentiment around these things as well. Probably the last thing I'd say, just as a kind of, because I'm a contrarian by nature perhaps, but one of the things I think about this kind of question, should we be breaking up big tech? What's the role of government intervening into these markets? And I'm a big critic of these large companies, but I do think we have to be careful about thinking that the market will work perfectly once they are broken up either, that it's kind of cementing a version of capitalism that perhaps is a bit of a fantasy, really, that this will foster innovation. I mean, I do think we need scale to be able to have innovation. I don't think it should necessarily come from large companies, but we need government investment in science and technology to be able to give scholars in that space the freedom to explore and come up with projects. And small startups all kind of doing their thing is not necessarily the answer to a more innovative economy either. And I just sort of wanted to put that into the mix, because sometimes I think the idea that we can return to a purely wonderfully functioning market can be a bit fantastical. And there's an interesting book, if people are interested in this topic, which is called The People's Republic of Walmart, which kind of plays with this idea and talks about how Walmart, for example, is a very planned company that's huge, that relies on just-in-time kind of supply and all these ways that it efficiently gets goods to market. Now, people criticise it, of course, but the planning there does work in some ways. It does deliver things to people. And the idea that a planned economy couldn't do that, for example, does seem to be contradicted by these examples. We're often, told we're in this capitalist society, but here are these big companies that plan how they manage their competitors, but also the kinds of products they put on the market. And I think that's an interesting kind of counter suggestion to some of this narrative that comes out about what will be the consequences of breaking up big tech.
You've got your hand up, Dan.
Yeah, if I could just jump in there. I just think you've raised something really interesting, I think, Lizzie, which is that in all of these decisions, there's ultimately going to be trade-offs, right? So what I'm particularly focused on is what I've said earlier, and that is I'm particularly focused around the control over democratic speech that these platforms have. But let's say that you break up Facebook and you make them sell off Instagram. That's not going to solve the problem of preventing hate speech on now just 2 platforms instead of 1. In fact, it may make it harder. And this is the really challenging thing, is that there's benefits. There's probably competition benefits, certainly from having a multitude of voices. But there's downsides to this as well, in that it's potentially going to create other harms that may prove more difficult to rectify. Unfortunately, I don't have the answer for this. I tend towards thinking that more competition is still ultimately better, but it is going to result in some downsides if this does result in sort of these companies being broken up.
Yeah, Tom's just made the interesting point, is a solution to make power fairer rather than fragmented. And I do think power is the missing part. I get very frustrated with some of the digital discussion where it becomes about privacy, as if privacy is the aim of whereas it's always seemed to me that it's more about power and the way power is being exercised. And I do share your concerns, Lizzie, that if we just jump into a world that says markets operating without impediment within the appropriate constraints of the capitalist model from the 20th century is how we're going to create a fairer place for us to develop the civil society and the businesses that are going to sort of get us through the next little period, then we're probably whistling in the wind. That said, it feels like we need to break things down before they can start up again. And for mine, the idea, and we've talked about this a bit in the past, like it's not that these big tech companies are full of terrible, evil people who are trying to, you know, create a dystopia. They are all people feeling like they are contributing to the vision of their companies, which is articulated to make the world a better place. But that concentration of power creates its own momentum. And unless we have counterpoints, which I'd argue come from both regulation and civil society, then of course there's going to be either by unintended or intended consequences that are contrary to the public interest. So yeah,
I might just jump in and say one more thing, and I don't know whether this is too off topic, but the example that comes to mind is actually Elon Musk and SpaceX. And I mean, I really am not a fan of Elon Musk, but you know, one of the things that that company is known for is being innovative, for example, but they're really piggybacking off public investment in space technology by NASA and, you know, the American taxpayer and others. To be able to fund that research and technology from which then a private company is profiting and will profit considerably and potentially have a monopoly market over private space travel. And, you know, Elon Musk kind of tweets all the time, as I'm sure lots of people know, but one of the things he talked about is how he might consider indentured labour for people who might wish to go to the colony on Mars, that you could work off the price of your trip when you get to Mars. So I don't want that guy in charge of private space travel. And I think it's also a tragedy that that kind of public investment that got, you know, people to the moon has been squandered and given away to the private market. And I think there is a role for government. I think it's easy to think that that's no longer the case, or, you know, it's unfashionable to say so. But I think it is important to remember that some of our key innovations have come out of public spending and investment in people to give them the freedom to do that work without being beholden to either a university, say, or some other kind of criteria like that, but also to not be beholden to the market. And that's a very important strategy for ensuring that we get innovations that can help us, you know, progress.
So let's bring it closer to home for a moment. So the ACCC had a pretty busy couple of weeks. And before I go into what's happened with the ACCC, let's just talk about the ACCC. So in America, we've got these old laws that legislators are trying to breathe life into. Daniel, it seems like in the ACCC, we've actually got a government agency that takes this stuff seriously. So in the context of what we've been talking about in terms of antitrust, how do you see the ACCC and who's driving this? Because it seems like there's some seriously committed people sort of running the tech agenda inside there at the moment.
Oh, I think Rod Sims is driving it ultimately as the chair of the ACCC, and I think he's done a remarkable job of the inquiry into digital platforms and the subsequent code, which was released last week. I mean, I have to admit, so when this digital platforms inquiry was first announced a few years ago, as part of a deal with Nick Xenophon, if I recall, to get it through the Senate, some other media reforms to enable consolidation to occur. I was pretty skeptical. I just felt like there was not much that an Australian regulator would be able to do to regulate these massive platforms, you know, domiciled in the US. And I'm thankful to say, or pleased to say, I've been proved wrong. I mean, I think what we have seen here is, one, they've identified the really substantial power and problems this brings in the Australian context. And two, in the code that has been released last week, which I probably should explain, has come up with what looks to be a really good remedy for correcting that imbalance of power that exists, particularly with media publishers. Should I give a sort of rundown of what's happened? Would that be helpful?
Yeah, sure. That's good.
Okay, I think, look, a lot of people may know this, but so the digital platforms inquiry took place over the last couple of years. I think most people know, and the ultimate outcome of this, if you like, was a draft bill which was released last Friday by the ACCC to correct the power imbalance that exists between the digital platforms and the news publishers in this country. So what that is effectively trying to do is make it fairer, so that the benefit that Google and Facebook specifically receive from publisher content, they effectively have to pay for. So that benefit comes in a number of forms, but firstly, publishers such as The Guardian and many others produce news content which delivers engagement on Google and Facebook, which Google and Facebook get benefit from, which they do not pay for. And secondly, Google and Facebook also receive a benefit from the consumer data which they harvest, no doubt much to Lizzie's disgust, on publisher platforms, and mine too, for what it's worth. And again, there is no fair value exchange for that data. So what the code does is it's provided a way for us to negotiate with these platforms in order to be able to get a fairer share of that revenue that they generate from it. And it also has a final arbitration model at the end, whereby if we don't come to an agreement on our own, then effectively the ACCC can, or the arbitrators that are part of this process can select the most reasonable commercial offer of those respective of the platforms and the publishers, and determine which one makes the most sense and award that.
So you are actually negotiating with Google and Facebook at the moment. What's that like? Like, do you just go in there and bang the table, or how does it work?
Well, I mean, to be clear, we've still got a way to go yet. So this is a draft bill, and I mean, it has to be passed by the government. I'm fairly certain it's going to have bipartisan support, so I suspect it will probably be passed by the end of this calendar year. Then we enter into a fairly specific process. There's a 3-month negotiation period, which exists between the publishers and the digital platforms. At the end of that 3-month process, if we haven't formed agreement, there's a 45-day arbitration period, and then a final arbitration at the end of that if we still can't come to an agreement. But look, what this does, I guess the key point is, we've raised these concerns with the publishers, with the platforms for years now, and because of the imbalance of power that's existed, we haven't really got anywhere. The difference now is that the platforms are forced to come to a fairer negotiation, or have a fairer negotiation with publishers such as The Guardian, and therefore share some of the tremendous benefit that they are receiving from publisher content and the really important journalism that's vital to Australian democracy.
Lizzie, one of the interesting things in the draft code is that the ABC and SBS are specifically withdrawn from the negotiations. So any benefit that Dan and the publishers can get for private media isn't going to be shared with the public media. What do you think the thinking behind that is?
Well, I mean, I can sort of understand that, because, I'm not sure it is the ABC's job to be negotiating like Dan is with private companies like that. And I also think there's a bigger problem here, which is really those companies need to start paying more tax, and that's how we fund the ABC, and through taxpayer revenue. And I think we need to have a conversation as to why it needs to be better funded, because it's suffered so many cuts of late. So I prefer that conversation kind of takes place much more in a separate domain about what we do with our taxpayer dollars and how we fund an institution like the ABC that's a vital piece of infrastructure, as well as a source of obviously investigative journalism. Can I ask you though, Dan, to break ranks, do you think about also reorienting away? We've talked a lot about this, I should say, in these sessions about advertiser revenue models for journalism. Do you think that this does still drive a need or an interest amongst media companies to look for alternative sources of revenue to continue functioning? Like, to what extent is that still an important priority for media to engage in, given that they've now potentially got this new source of revenue from the digital platforms?
Look, I won't speak for other publishers, but I can certainly speak from The Guardian's point of view. So, look, more than half of our revenue now comes from consumers who make primarily voluntary financial contributions to us. But in the case of, News Corp or the 9 mastheads, they're typically in the form of subscriptions. And for all of us, these things are growing rapidly, and they've been growing incredibly rapidly since the bushfires at the start of the year, and then subsequently the coronavirus crisis. So that is a good thing, because it's ultimately making us, I guess, less reliant on digital advertising, where Google and Facebook are so dominant. But look, for us at least, advertising is still a really important revenue stream for us, and one that we still think is going to grow substantially for us. So we're certainly not walking away from it. The key point though, which I think is probably what you're getting at, is you can still do digital advertising, and you can do it in a way which is respectful of consumers' privacy. You can do it in a way which is whereby it's, almost old-fashioned contextually based advertising, which we touched on, I think, last fortnight, rather than having to build up a really detailed profile of a consumer and following them around the internet, and in what is, I think, a pretty clear invasion of consumer privacy. So look, I'm not sure if that answers your question, Lizzie, but for us, we're absolutely still focused on growing advertising. We still think that we can, but at the same time, we're really focused on growing consumer revenue. But in the meantime, this is not you can walk and chew gum at the same time, right? That we're going to pursue both of those things, and at the same time say to the digital platforms, specifically Google and Facebook, you have to give us a fair share of the value that our content delivers to your platform. So all three of these things can hopefully become a material contributor to producing or helping to fund really important journalism for Australia.
One more question for you, Dan. Is there anything inherent in this negotiations which the media companies would commit to reinvesting any of the money that was delivered back into journalism, or could it just go to shareholders for the sake of a private company or the Murdochs?
Look, I guess there's certainly that potential. There's certainly that potential. I mean, you know, Nine is a listed entity, News Corp, similar, but obviously controlled by Murdoch. Yeah, there is nothing to suggest that the money that we harvest from this process, wrong word, but that we earn from this process is not passed back to the ultimate owners as some form of dividend.
And there's been no talk of a broader fund for journalism rather than it going to individuals going to into a pool.
No. There was some talk of that initially, of effectively creating sort of a copyright agency type model whereby the platforms have to pay some funds into a pool of money, which is then distributed. I think the ACCC has made the right decision in not doing that for a few reasons, actually. I mean, I think one, you can imagine how easy it will be getting us to sit alongside the table at News Corp and agree how to divide those funds. I think that would be a pretty difficult negotiation to have. But secondly, I mean, I think that's pretty close to a tax, and maybe that's, Lizzie, that's what you think probably should happen. But the problem with that is that if it looks like a tax, it can potentially run foul of free trade agreements that exist between us and the United States. So I think that the negotiations that can happen bilaterally now, I think are a more effective way to go. But to answer your question, Peter, I just want to make one point really clear. In the Guardian's case, because we are owned by the Scott Trust, all of the profits that we make go back into growing journalism, just in case anyone on this call wasn't aware of that.
I'm going to see if Amy wants to unmute, just because she seemed to know more about this than all of us in terms of
Peter.
But are you there, Amy?
Yeah, I am. I don't know more than anyone. I just happen to have read the code just for my, I have a background working in media companies, and we've been through some of these negotiations in the early days of online news distribution. So it's a personal interest. So no, I wouldn't put myself forward as an expert, but yes, I have read the code.
So in terms of the ABC and SBS, though, you were saying there that they do have...
So the code, there's two parts to it. There's the bargaining for remuneration, and then there's minimum standards. So the ABC and SBS are allowed to register with ACMA to participate in the minimum standards piece. So that would be notification of algorithm changes that would affect the display of news and ranking of news. So they can't chip in, they can't ask for compensation, but all the other pieces of the code, which are mostly about data sharing and the way the algorithms work. So there are requirements around, you've got the news, the platforms are, I think they've got 28 days to provide in a comprehensible fashion notice, 28 days notice of any algorithm changes. So that's kind of where the ABC come in.
And if I could just add to that, there's another really part of this code, which I should have mentioned at the start, which I think was Amy has just touched on, is those non-financial parts of the code. There's another really important provision here, which basically states that the platforms, Google and Facebook in particular, have to give publishers control over consumers' ability to comment on their stories. So this is particularly relevant for Facebook, where basically at the moment, we're on the Facebook page that we set up to distribute our content, the Guardian's content. If a consumer makes a defamatory comment on that content, we are we as a company are liable for that, which is the result of the Boller case, which took place earlier this year. So what this does, and there's no way for us to avoid that risk, because we simply cannot, at the moment, we simply cannot moderate or turn off comments other than after they have been published. So what this code does do is it enables us to be able to turn off comments on stories, thereby mitigating the possibility that we're going to be sued for defamation because of something that some consumer makes on one of our makes on one of our stories.
Great. There was also a question from Lucy. I'll just see if she's happy to come on unmuted there, Lucy.
Oh yeah, I can.
Why don't you hit down with your question that was in the chat?
Thank you. Yeah, sorry, I come at this from a little bit of a place of ignorance, but I guess my concern with this sort of model is, doesn't it ultimately encourage more clickbaity and viral content? If you're getting a part of the engagement, what has driven engagement are sort of the algorithmic loopholes that you tend to get into with that. So, how can you control for that as a part of the code? And when other countries ultimately try to replicate this, how can you control for something like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it was a concern that I think many of us had before this code was announced, but I think how the code has been drafted actually mitigates that concern. So look, there's no suggestion here, by the way, that Google and Facebook should make a payment to us for the traffic that they send to us. Not at all. It's actually more Google, and it's more general than that, if you like. So there are three things to consider when determining what the payment should be between Google and Facebook and the respective publishers. The first one is the direct benefit that the platforms receive. So for example, in Facebook's case, when I think at last read, publisher content provides about 4 to 5% of the engagement in Facebook's newsfeed, and yet publishers receive no compensation for that. So what should that be? Critically, the second point is, what is the indirect benefit that Google and Facebook receive by virtue of the fact that consumers now know that if they want to read the news, they just need to go to Google News or go to the Facebook newsfeed, as an example, and therefore what's the compensation that should be for consumers on that? It's not based on how many clicks you get, it's just based on the fact that consumers are doing that. And then the third point, there's a criteria, if you like, to consider what the payment should be is, what is the investment in journalism that the publishers are making? So what is the size of our journalism team? So if anything, there's an incentive to invest more in journalists than there is to invest in clickbait, and that is for the good.
Hey, speaking of clickbait, we should probably move the discussion on a bit, but thanks for those questions and thanks for your guys' responses. So it leads into the other big ACCC thing last week, which was the announcement they were going to prosecute Google, really around what seems like a broken promise. I might be sort of dumbing this down, but Google purchased a company called, was it DoubleClick? A few years back. DoubleClick is one of those creepy mapping the way that you go around the web, and the deal when Google
not quite,
took it over.
not quite.
You explain to me.
Not quite.
Everything's creepy in my view.
Once again, I suspect I'm about to be attacked by Peter and Lizzie, but we'll see. DoubleClick is effectively was ad serving technology. So what I think a lot of people don't realize is all of the ads that you see on publisher websites, be that The Guardian, be that News Corp, be that the 9 mastheads, we all utilize what is the leading technology to serve those ads, which was the DoubleClick business, which Google acquired and has now evolved to become Google Ad Manager. So the action that the ACCC took, which...
Hold on, so what does it do? What do you...
Oh, sorry. So it basically enables us to serve ads on the website, basically. So when a consumer comes and a page view loads, it basically is the technology that says, here is someone on your website, serve them an ad for this campaign or that campaign or that campaign. So it's basically just an advertising campaign management tool. Now it plugs into... But it's telling
you what to do because it's doing all that creepy stuff with me.
Well, I don't know if it's necessarily creepy. What it is doing is it is effectively... Well, that's what I think the ACCC has taken issue with. I don't think the technology is necessarily creepy. I think it's the collection of the data which is the problem. Which so if I can explain that, and then perhaps I'll hand over to you guys. So what the ACCC took action over was the allegation, if you like, that Google was not informing consumers on the data they were collecting. So I'm not going to comment on whether or not there's any basis to that. But what I will say is Google changed their privacy policy in 2016. And what that meant was when a consumer was on The Guardian's website, for example, and indeed almost every other publisher's website that used the formal DoubleClick technology, now Google Ad Manager, what that enabled them to do was collect consumer data on that user when they were on those publisher websites. So I think the question we have to ask is it reasonable for consumers to think that when they're on The Guardian, that Google is collecting data and using that data to update the profile that Google has on that particular user? That's what this action is basically about.
It was also the way the terms were changed. It was kind of this feel-good message that was almost, hey, we're going to give you a better service, without it really being clear what that was going to mean. I don't know if you've got a view on this, Lizzie, particularly in the context of our earlier discussions.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think consent in a lot of these circumstances is pitched as, offering consumer better choices when really I don't think consumers know at all what's going on. And that's what I think drives the kind of creepy criticism that, you know, that all this information can be collected about you in circumstances where you don't expect it and then used in different ways. And that, you know, thinking about, I guess, how your experience of online life can be monetized, the fact that you're, not you personally, but you as a member of a cohort are interested in reading Guardian articles and what they are, can then be used to advertise to you in circumstances where you didn't realize you were being watched while doing that, seems pretty troubling. And, you know, one of the ACCC's recommendations in their report on digital platforms was to have an inquiry into this kind of stuff, because it is quite complicated. The tech behind how ads are generated and produced and sold in that space, and the auctions for eyeballs, how this takes place is quite complex and involves a lot of different companies. And I think that's a great recommendation, because I think actually the more the public knows about this, the more likely we are to get better policy on it. Part of the problem is so much of this occurs in an opaque way in which consumers have no idea that it's happening. And it requires then, you know, regulators, watchdogs like the ACCC to sue these large platforms, which I think it's good that the ACCC is taking this kind of action. But I also want to see a legislative regime, laws that reflect people's expectations in this regard as well, so that it isn't just down to regulators to kind of hold companies to account, that we have a public discussion about how the political economy of data works, and we have, you know, critical digital literacy for people who are spending huge amounts of their lives online.
I think that's a really good point. And I kind of feel, I'm always worried that these talks are getting down into the weeds, but I also, and I'll be interested in people's feedbacks. We send out the feedback forms at the end of each of these. Even with this audience, I feel that each time we talk to you guys, we get a deeper understanding of the way these machines work and the legal framework around it. But it does take an investment in time and intellectual energy to understand what's going on. And it does seem to be a lot easier just to say, nah, it's all technology, it's too hard, don't you reckon?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of think critical digital literacy will become almost like civics, like understanding the political economy of the web will be a requirement to be a citizen, or it should be, you know, that's what we should aspire to do, you know, not just teaching children how to use a computer, but also how to critically engage with platforms, understand who makes money, why something is written from a particular perspective, who's paying whose bills.
Read a set of terms and conditions and understand them. We've been doing some research with the Australia Institute on this. You need the equivalent of a second year graduate education to understand the language according to the sort of the systems you run that through.
Yeah, well, the contractual model is broken. It doesn't work in these settings. You can't say, you know, the usual understanding of contract is that it's two free agents bargaining and coming to an agreement, but like that's just clearly not what's going on here. So we do need to regulate that relationship. It needs to be treated differently than other kinds of private relationships, because these companies hold a huge amount of power, and we should be able to dictate the terms by which they offer services, not just allow them to kind of, you know, do what they like and then plead for forgiveness afterwards.
If I could just add to that,
yeah,
sorry to jump in. Just it is worth noting, just perhaps a note of optimism about this, or hope perhaps is a better take on it, is that I think that the consumers are becoming more informed about this. I think GDPR coming in the EU was basically to deal with exactly this problem of no one reads the privacy policy, right? No one actually understands what data is being collected. So you have to actually opt in order to give consent for that to take place. We've also just seen last week the implementation of California's Privacy Act, CCPA, which is to the same, or largely achieving the same things. And also it's worth noting that Australia's privacy laws, largely because of the ACCC's digital platforms inquiry of a year ago, are also under review and likely, I think, to be changed in the next year or so. Lizzie, you probably get a better view on that than I do, but it does feel like it's becoming, there's more control going back to consumers, and that is a good thing. The next thing we need to do is educate consumers to make sure they actually understand what they are consenting to and what they are not, because at the moment I still think there's a pretty big gap in understanding there.
Yeah, and also the cost of non-consent. Like, it's not like a choice, I'd like that or not. It's, well, you can't come in. So the consent is really access to the platform.
Yeah, isn't it somebody wittier than me to find capitalism as endless choice about things that don't matter? And I do think that's kind of the point here, like you can, often when companies talk about giving you good choices for how you use your data and set your privacy, there's a lot of things that are left beyond that capacity to choose. And it would be better, I think, if that was made available to people through public discussion, through good lawmaking, and through engagement by policymakers and representatives. I mean, that's one of the other key problems. So, that's why I think this ACCC stuff is so important, because it changes how we have these discussions for the better.
The other story in the last fortnight that sort of attracted my attention in the context of the ACCC inquiry was Chris Nouse and The Guardian had come up with evidence that an American think tank funded, partly through undisclosed donations from Google, the Global Antitrust Institute, had been a particularly virulent critic of the ACCC platforms inquiry. Astroturfing happens in all sorts of industries. It is hardly surprising that the tech companies are in the same game, although I must say, when there is all this focus on the tech companies in terms of being honest about the way information's being provided, it does beg the question, doesn't it?
I mean, I find it just really alarming. I think the way lobbying works is often not something that's commonly understood by the voter, and that, you assume when you elect a representative, they're there for you, and you don't see what often goes on behind closed doors, just how prevalent this kind of lobbying is. I mean, there's huge industries in Washington, of course, but it also happens in Australia. And I think the interesting thing about that, some of the reporting on this, and there was an article in the New York Times, and obviously The Guardian covered it as well, Dan, but is, how they talk about training judges as well on these kinds of questions, and running seminars on things like competition law and the like, and recruiting judges to go to these conferences. And that, I think, is a big problem. Like, is that permissible? We expect, politicians to be lobbied. Do we expect the judicial arm of government to be lobbied? I mean, should we be concerned about that? And it's very pervasive. And there's a really good book on this I'd recommend if people are interested in this topic generally. It's not specific to tech, but it's called
Lizzie's reading list to go out at the end of this.
Sorry.
You got a bit of time. You're indoors most of the time at the moment, aren't you?
I know. So I don't want to be the person that's just giving you readings, but anyway, it's a book by Nancy McLean called Democracy in Chains, and it talks about how conservatives organise. Essentially, we often think of the right or conservatives as not being activists or organising themselves to get up particular policies. That's much more seen as a tradition of leftists, progressives, and radicals, but actually they are very sophisticated in how they do it. And she kind of profiles the Koch brothers and the like. And so, I think that's kind of a deep insight into sometimes how these systems work, and we should never, ignore the fact that it does happen, and we should be alive to it.
And not all of it is under the surface. The other thing, to bring you back in, Dan, I'm also amazed at the way that our media companies are happy to receive money from the Google News Initiative and the Facebook News Initiative, and it's the Walkleys, it's the ABC, I think it's the Guardian. It feels to me that is not under the cloak, but it feels to me a bit like doctors taking money from big tobacco, or, environmentalists taking money from big coal. So, justify.
Can we justify it?
Yeah. How do you sleep at night?
If I could, just before I answer that question, which I'd be more than happy to, Peter, but before I get to that, I think just this point around the Guardian article and that think tank which was funded by Google, I think it brings us back probably to where we started this conversation with the antitrust hearings. I mean, as these companies get bigger, they get more political power, they have more lobbyists, more of this is going on. Is this any surprise? This is why competition law is important. This is why breaking up big tech is probably the right thing to do, provided you can do it in a smart way, because ultimately the bigger these companies get, the more political power they're going to have. And if I could add just one more book to the reading list, The Curse of Bigness by Tim Wu is another one that I would really recommend.
We will send all these out at the end of the session.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book which sort of demonstrates how political power kind of can accumulate and does deal with a lot of the tech giants. So to answer your question though, Peter, and thank you very much for it. Yes, we do take funding from both Google through their Google News Initiative, and we recently took funding from Facebook as part of a revenue initiative that they were doing. It was really clear what they funded. So we were public on this, by the way, and completely transparent about it. I think that's one really important point. Google partnered with us to fund a project which is still ongoing, whereby we are trying to develop technology which would improve podcasting experience. So In simple terms, if you're listening to a podcast, whether that's on the Apple Player or Pocket Casts or Google's Player or whichever one, the ability to set a new standard so that if you're referring to something, an image or a piece of text or something like that, it can basically come up on the consumer's device when they're doing it. So we think that's ultimately a good thing. Google agreed and they funded it. So to be really clear, they did not fund any journalism. It was a technical project. The second part of this is we participated in an accelerator with Facebook last year. And we received a grant from them effectively to help experiment with growing our reader revenue. Now, and that is ongoing at the moment as well. The point I would make is that, yes, we took the funding from Google and Facebook. We also work really closely with Google and Facebook in a number of areas, including, as I mentioned earlier, we use Google's advertising technology for ad serving. So I think the point here is, provided you're transparent about where you are working with them, and still point out where there are problems, as we have done via this ACCC process, then I'm able to sleep at night. But feel free to fire at Will if you disagree.
No. I don't think that media companies shouldn't be taking any support they can at the moment. I guess it's always that balance between buying compliance and, I don't know. I find.
Yeah, sure. But have they, Peter? That's the point, right? Have they bought compliance?
I think Lizzie, I think Digital Rights Watch has also done projects with some big tech, haven't they?
Oh, we've been on the same page in policy questions, for example, like on the anti-encryption laws, which there's actually a hearing today about them before the Parliamentary Joint Committee. We've certainly been on the same page as a number of big tech companies because we agree weakening encryption is bad for digital security. And so we will find people or companies that we're friends with on that topic that we're very critical of these companies and how they deal with privacy and similar kinds of questions. So, it's a slightly different issue, I suppose, to what Dan's talking about. I understand why it's sort of unrealistic to claim that it's outrageous for the media industry, the media, to take money from these companies. But I do think it's not ideal, and I think we would be working towards different ways of doing things. And I know I sound like a broken record here, but often when you talk to journalists, they're very worried about government investment in these things. But I could see a situation where you could have government investing in early career journalists and in creating paid positions that are not, maybe not hands off insofar as government's involved in the reporting, but could be seconded to organisations. I think we should explore public funding of these things as well, so that you could take the money from these companies and filter through government other ways of cultivating journalism and tech projects even in journalism. So I don't think we should think about other ways of doing things as well, because I can understand why people feel uncomfortable about it.
Yeah. I agree, by the way. It is worth noting that there are government grants that exist, particularly for regional masters at the moment, where they are funding journalism projects. And it is also worth mentioning that we take philanthropic money from different foundations to do specific projects. I think the point is transparency. If I could just make one more point on this, Peter, that the difficulty, right, is that, not the difficulty, just the reality is these platforms are so big and have some really fantastic technology as well that we all benefit from and want to work with. So I think it comes back to the fact you can walk and chew gum at the same time. You can work with the good parts of these companies and criticize the bad parts. I think that is the point. That's what we should be doing here.
Which is where they almost become like nation states, don't they?
Well, they're bigger than some, aren't they?
Love the government. Hey, I've been trying for the last 3 of these to get you talking about Uber, Lizzie. We've got about 5 minutes till the end.
Sure.
But you are running, or your company is running, a class action on behalf of some Melbourne cab drivers against Uber. And I've imbued a whole lot of meaning into this case, because in my head, I've always had a thing that Uber just did this terra nullius approach to law, where they come in and they say, your laws don't apply. We're not a taxi company. We're a ride sharing service that pays you to drive from A to B. And I've seen your class action as Marbo. I've seen it as something that will break that sense. Am I over egging it? And give us the 3-minute version. We might go back and do a longer version next time we meet.
Yeah, I must say I wouldn't use that metaphor, but despite that, I think you do, Peter, and you're entitled to ignore my advice on all occasions as you do. Yes. So it is me. I'm running a class action against Uber. That's my day job. I am suing a number of Uber companies on behalf of the taxi and hire car industry in Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, and Western Australia. And the claim is in conspiracy by unlawful means, which sounds very fancy, but what it means is that you come to an agreement, you enter into a market, you do something unlawfully, and you benefit from that, causing harm to those who are complying with the rules. So the claim is that taxis and hire car drivers, operators, owners of licenses, you know, they had the relevant accreditations and the vehicles with the appropriate license. They ran a business in those markets, and Uber came in, said that the law didn't apply to them, essentially, and worked with people who didn't have those accreditations and licenses to run a business that provided a very similar service, and that caused harm to those existing participants in the industry. And this is kind of their business model. They've talked publicly about their business model. They talk about going into markets, and if they don't confront resistance from regulators and carrying on, they talk about things like flipping the regs, where they change the laws to suit their business model. And I don't think that that's an acceptable way to do business, and I think it's actually unlawful, which is why we're bringing the claim.
And they had a crack at kicking it out of court the other week? Of
course, they absolutely did. So we've just managed to make it through, pending an appeal. One of the key kind of milestones where, you know, often you hear about these things. It's called a strikeout application, where the defendants might look at your pleadings, your written case, and say it doesn't work. It's not going to win. This shouldn't be allowed to continue. And it can take quite a lot of time to resolve some of those issues and get through them. And we've just managed to get through that finally. So we had a hearing in the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal handed down their judgment. They've given us the green light to continue. And so we'll move into the centre of, you know, the middle part of the case, where we get access to discovery, things like documents, where we can review what the company actually did in the relevant time. So it's a significant achievement. It's quite technical, I suppose, but getting through that stage is important, and I'm really glad that we have, and I'm looking forward to this case progressing.
Oh, well, mazel tov. And interested in seeing how it progresses over the next few months.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of policy issues around Uber, and Uber's obviously a company that attracts a lot of commentary and criticism. And I think I did put a reading, or I suggested a reading to Peter, which went out in the email, which people might want to look at. I mean, I talk about Uber a lot, of course, and a lot of people, you know, talk to me about what they like about the service and what they don't like. And I think it's a really interesting article to kind of understand, you know, some of the things we were talking about. What's the role of democracy? What's the role of regulation in these kinds of situations? And a company, you know, kind of coming in and trying to see things differently, and whether that's an appropriate way to do business. And the author of that article sets out the role of point-to-point transport and what we expect from it, and what we perhaps do or don't get. And I think it's worth reading if you're interested in this topic.
Yeah, that's great. And maybe we'll go into Uber a bit more next time. So thank you. So while you're fighting Uber, while Dan's negotiating for the future of the Australian media with Google, I'll be sitting up in my roof doing these things. Next week, for those that are regulars, we've got the Political Geek Fest on Tuesday, and then Thursday we've got the Guardian Book Club with Kate Grenville, which is pretty big.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's going to be so good.
Yeah. So join us, and thanks for being around with us today, guys. We'll send out that reading list. There's about 5 books to read. I'll try to dig something out as well, although the things on the reading list, again, should keep you busy for a while. And there are a few people in the chat wanting to watch the full 5 hours. So there's a whole bunch of stuff to do. So thanks again, guys. Stay safe and well down in Melbourne. Lizzie, enjoy the sun, Dan, and everyone have a great Friday and a great weekend. Cheers, everyone.
Thanks, folks.